In today's conversation, I would like to explore with you my experiences of applying Reality Transurfing by Vadim Zeland since 2017, when I first came across this book. And it was after I came across this book was one of the inspirations that led to me making flow a priority in 2017, as you may know the story. I was in Playa del Carmen, Mexico, and I said, when was I the happiest? When was I the most effective in my business? When was I the most joyous, most fun? I was relating with people harmoniously, relationships were wonderful, etc. It was while I was in flow. So I want to discuss specific areas of the book and my personal experiences. I always say, you can really think for yourself. So you could relate to this book whatever way you'd like. You don't have to look and say, oh, Joseph relates this way or this other person relates that way. That's the way I should relate to this book. You can relate to this book whatever way you'd like. Ideally, you would relate to it in a way that works best for you. So I would like to share with you how I relate to this book in a way that works best for me, that has been effective. And it inspired being in flow because I find that the way I relate to this book fundamentally is it is a guide for being in flow. Flow in relation to the vision specifically. You have a vision, and then you would like to have a flow-based journey to actualizing the vision rather than one of stress and frustration. Unless you want the stress and frustration path, it's up to you. So we're going to be discussing pendulums, excess potential and importance, the flow of variations, the goal, or as I say, the vision and the means, being the observer and the mirror principle. So let's discuss the goal and the means. Like we always say, you commit to a vision. You choose the end frame of whatever that looks like in your imagination. You imagine yourself already having that which you desire, being in possession of what you desire to have, having that now in imagination. And then what happens is the means of how it happens appears through flow. So rather than trying to force how things happen, what happens is we be the observer or detach from what is referred to as pendulums. Pendulums in the book are referred to as energy structures created when groups of people think the same way. Now, these pendulums seem to hook your energy, steal your energy, force you into this timeline, that timeline, etc. But it's not actually doing that. It's just conditioning in the mind that is generating that kind of reactive response. As I always say, fight, flight, freeze, fawn response is generated by conditioning in mind, and you are not the conditioning. So you're not actually swayed by energetic structures. It just appears that way through conditioning. Now, as I mentioned, I'm discussing how I relate to this book, my personal experiences in relation to this book. So some of the things that I mention in here are not discussed in the book. Some of the things are discussed in the book. I found a way to relate to this book in a way that works perfectly for me, for my intention, which is to actualize my visions or manifest my visions from a state of flow rather than a state of stress, frustration, or more specifically, conditions in mind that generate stress and frustration as a result of identification. See, I like this concept of pendulums when people get together and they think in the same way. This is also related to groupthink. I don't know if you ever read this book. It's called The 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. In there, he says, beware the snares of groupthink. So again, people can think whatever way they would like to think. There are various groups of people. There are people that think in particular ways. There's different paradigms. There's different belief systems. In this regard, we can say different pendulums. Yet it does not mean you need to identify with their way of thinking. As I always say, you could really think for yourself. Sometimes what happens is the individual unknowingly, and now we know it's based on condition, becomes identified with ways of thinking which is not in harmony with their vision. Now, awareness is key. It's the master key. That is how I relate to being the observer. So in the book, it talks about how detaching from pendulums requires the individual to step out of automatic reactions or emotional traps, habitual identification. This allows for you to consciously choose then. You can really think for yourself, as I say, intuitively in the moment you know. Now I'd like to relate this over to the wonderful book, Power of Kabbalah by Yuda Berg. Power of Kabbalah has a foreword written by Madonna. It's a great book. So the premise of Power of Kabbalah is essentially to not react, to allow the light in, or as I say sometimes, allow that light of awareness to emerge. So you are that pure awareness, the witness, the pure observer that is beyond attachment, beyond concepts, beyond the programming that generates the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And as you are that beyond, you exist beyond the conditioning, you can allow, naturally, it happens. By grace and grace alone, the light of awareness emerges and the solution to whatever emerges. So, the concept, the mirror principle, whatever appearance changes simply by not reacting to the pendulum, and more specifically, not identifying with the conditioning in the subconscious mind that is generating the reactivity, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response in relation to the appearance. A practical example would be in business. What I notice when I made flow a priority, remain in flow, releasing identification, as I say, detaching, being the observer, what I noticed is flow, or more specifically, that light of awareness appearing as a flow-based conversation. If I use the example of conversations with prospects in a business. So, as you know, I have done my own sales in my IT business, in my consulting business and coaching business, from clients that came through this YouTube channel here, through partnership deals I did in my consulting practice, through referrals in my IT business. And what I have noticed is if I do not react to what a person says, if I just let it be, or we could say be at least neutral to the appearances. I like to say be at least neutral to the appearances because naturally I do personally find, as a result of applying this information here and everything that we talk about, that I actually experience happiness during rejection, happiness during objection. Person might think, how? How could you experience happiness during rejection? How can you experience happiness during objection? Because I could really think for myself. I can see the optimization data. I know I can then just adjust my positioning or choose a different angle. By the way, we talked about positions and angles in my other channel where I speak exclusively about flow-based entrepreneurship. If you're interested in that, I'll link in the description to it. The video that I released on Tuesday. So, I can really think for myself. I can choose from the infinite possibilities that exist now in imagination, from the infinite possibilities. I could choose how to relate to the appearance. So let's say, and that's why I experience happiness. So you can be at least neutral to it, at least neutral. Maybe in the earlier stages, this might be challenging. Yet what I have found is that through consistently performing the sales presentations, the prospecting sessions, conversations with people if I was about to become identified with a pendulum. I can, in the moment, release that identification. So you could say, oh yeah, it's the other person or the environment. I don't relate to it that way. The way I relate to it is it's not the other person. It's not the environment. It's the conditioning in mind, and I am not the conditioning in mind. You are not the conditioning in mind. You can dissolve that conditioning in the moment through the light of awareness. That is what is discussed in the power of Kabbalah. So it can appear as optimization data, and then through the objections or rejection, I know what to say next. Actually, I know what to do, what not to do, what to say, what not to say, which then what I have found is increased my conversion. The likelihood of them becoming clients has increased in a flow-based way. Or I have seen them come back later on and become clients later on. What I've also seen is them refer business to me. What I've also seen is through the optimization data, I knew how to adjust my copy on my landing pages to communicate in particular, precise ways in these videos to call out, you can say, or attract specific people that are watching these videos. By that is meant ideal client, ideal prospect. It's amazing how much precision one has if they do not identify with these pendulums. They do not identify more specifically with the conditioning. That is what is meant by being the observer, rather than having automatic reactions, which is based on that conditioning, which, look, if you are having a conversation with a prospect, or anybody for that matter, and they say something, or do something, or don't say something, or don't do something, and you identify with this conditioning in a way that generates a fight or flight response. Let's put aside the freeze and fawn response. Let's look at fight or flight response. What could happen is you'll unknowingly choose out of the infinite possibilities that exist now in imagination, in the space of variation. You choose what they call lifeline, where it plays out as theater of that conditioning, as a conflict if it was a fight response. Or if it's a flight response, the individual runs away from the opportunity that's presented in front of them. The opportunity is there to acquire the client, to gather some optimization data for adjusting your marketing, your sales, your fulfillment, your operations, different aspects of your business. Knowing that in the infinite space of variations, all possibilities exist now. And this is true. As I mentioned, you right now can choose to relate to whatever's appearing. You can choose. You could relate to it this way or that way or whatever way you'd like. What this book teaches is ideally relate to it from the vision. Ideally relate to it from the vision, which lately we've been finding and discovering that it happens naturally just by not identifying. Remaining, you could say, as the observer. That's a way of saying it. You are actually the observer. It's just a conditioning in mind that suggests that you are a person that is separate from the observer. And the person that seemingly is separate from the observer, which the Bible calls the old man, identifies with this kind of conditioning which generates a fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, and we can call it an entanglement with these pendulums. And then it seems to the person in mind, which is illusory, that attention is hooked by the pendulum or the groupthink, stealing your energy, forcing you into their lifelines, getting emotionally involved with whatever without consciously choosing it. And as they say, pendulums seem to thrive on importance and excess potential. So let's get into that. Essentially what we're doing is we're dropping the excess potential and the importance. How do you drop the importance and excess potential? So I could say to you, just drop the importance and excess potential. But that might not make any sense. How do you actually do it? Well, you get better at it with practice by not identifying. Just let it be. Let it be. You could choose to relate to it differently, ideally from your vision. Or you could let it be, and what I have found is it transforms on its own. You just remain on course, is another way of saying it. You remain on track, or that lifeline. Like you'll actually see it physically in form. You'll stay on course because you did not react. And not only that, you'll dissolve the conditioning. So, the excess potential, which is generated by the conditioning, generated by the mind, essentially, or more specifically, the conditioning in the mind, results in what is called problems or obstacles, or it's seemingly pushing the goal away or destabilizing your emotional state. This is why in transurfing, it is encouraged to reduce the importance and even in a way normalize everything. And by that is meant very specifically. It doesn't mean not have compassion to the challenges that people have. It just means see things as they are without the charge of the conditioning. And then you'll be able to see clearly and know clearly what to do, what not to do, what to say, what not to say, etc. in a way that benefits everyone. Now, importance, the way Vadim Zeland describes it, can be looked at as how he describes it as inner importance and outer importance. So inner importance is, I'm special, but this other person is not. Ego identifications. I call it that, ego identifications. So if we as an individual identify with that condition, look through that condition, this world appears as us versus them. So in relation to the mirror principle, it plays out as us versus them kind of theater in our lives. Because if the person says, I'm special, but this other person is not, then it can generate egotistical behaviors. We can say it that way, because then what happens is how we relate with that person is through that condition. Consider this for a moment. What if that person actually had valuable information? Through excess importance, we're not able to see it. We're seeing it distorted. Reality is distorted through that condition. So he also speaks about outer importance. And then the goal controls them, or the vision controls them. So being in flow essentially is the result of dissolving conditioning, where inner and outer are experienced as one. And when the individual has a high importance in relation to the vision, they may try really hard, force control. I trust you know exactly what it is that I'm talking about. No shame, no condemnation. I've done it many times. I've had visions, I've had goals, and at times I would force, try to control, and do these things, and it would result in suffering. So high importance results in suffering. It would result in suffering. Or I would think, I'm special because I achieved this or that. Now I create an identity around whatever kind of appearances. And this can happen with entrepreneurs, or if a person looks a particular way, dresses a particular way, etc. They may form an identity around the way they look, around the way they dress, around the money that they have, the car that they have, etc. And they go around looking for people to approve or validate that. And if they don't get it, they become identified with what he calls the pendulums. Now, then they start chasing, and they'll start to notice that they're in this energy structure of chasing, and everything around it seems that way. They're in that life track where it seems like chasing is the norm, but it's not norm. Or more specifically, it's not how they truly desire to live. So then it appears as hooking their attention or stealing their energy. Here's a way I've seen it play out with entrepreneurs. So let's say they formed an identity around their possessions. They may hang out with another group of entrepreneurs, and they might look at the watch that they have, or the car that they drive, or the house that they live in, or whatever, the clothes that they wear. And rather than saying, hey, that's wonderful, that's great, I can be inspired by this person, and their style is the best style, and I may or may not. As I say, really think for yourself. I may or may not get that watch or car. If I truly desire, I'll get that car or the watch or the house. Yet if I truly do not desire it, what if you really, realistically have the money in your bank account? Do you need to show signs that you have the money in your bank account in order for people to like you? See, that's based on condition. So then what can happen is they'll start looking at these other people, put them on a pedestal, excess importance or pendulum, and then do all these things in order to get it in a way that's stress and force-based. Now, as I said, nuanced point. Nothing wrong with having the cars, the clothes, the watch, whatever it is that you want. Ideal lifestyle, living it your style, nothing wrong with that. If we drop the importance to the goal, if we drop that, what happens is everything flows naturally. Everything flows naturally. So then you remain as the observer, and perhaps when you're, let's say, inspired by another person's achievements, you get some ideas that show up, and you move forward with those ideas. They generate more income, and prior to generating the income, you're in sales presentations or running some ad campaigns or marketing campaigns or something like that, rolling some initiatives, marketing initiatives. Along the way, you're optimizing from a state of flow. And you inevitably get there. You achieve those number goals. And not only that, you remain in flow. You're not identified with these pendulums. Nothing sways you. And if, let's say, you are swayed by appearances in relation to the mirror principle, we don't fight the mirror. We don't run away from the mirror. We relate harmoniously with this world, or as I say sometimes, inner and outer fundamentally are one. They appear to be in perfect harmony. Now you eventually get to that point. Everything appears to flow. You're neutral to the pendulums. If you are about to react, you're like, oh, opportunity. Dissolve the conditioning that's generating this reactivity. And even the pendulum appears to transform. I trust you've seen this many times. It does not appear to hook your energy, steal your energy. We've actually spoke about this in Flow-Based Prosperity, my group coaching and mastermind service. If you're interested in it, I'll link in the description to it. We spoke about it yesterday, about how, just by applying what we're talking about here, which is being as you are fundamentally, and this is a great book that articulates, practically speaking, how the entrepreneur can be as they are in flow in relation to their vision. Everyone is noticing how you walk into a room which prior we could have said, okay, that's a pendulum, that's a groupthink, or whatever, that prior was stealing our energy, hooking our attention, forcing us into different timelines. Again, that us versus them, excess importance. As the conditioning has fallen away, you remain in flow. You enter into the room, and the room appears to transform to be in flow. So from a reality transurfing perspective, you remain in your ideal life track or lifeline. You remain in it, and you literally experience it. So of course, if you identified with that conditioning, the room appears to be stress, frustration, force-based, steal your energy, hook your attention, etc. Of course, it's obvious. We know that. No shame, no condemnation. We've experienced it. I've experienced it. Maybe you didn't experience it, but I experienced it a number of times. And then I knew exactly what was going on. So now, if you look at our vision, let's talk about how we can apply this to our vision. So if your vision is entrepreneurial success, your vision is X amount of dollars in your bank account, net. If you apply what we're talking about here, what happens is you'll discover your way, which is your best way. You'll flow your way. You'll discover your style of innovation, and what you innovate, the product or service that you put out, it's going to be your style, the best style. Your style of marketing, your style of sales, your style of operation, your style of leadership, and even your style of finance, by that it is meant specifically, you may live in this country or that country, get particular kinds of tax breaks. I've had a conversation with an entrepreneur that chose to live in a specific country because they get a huge tax break living in that country. Meanwhile, there's another entrepreneur who lives in another country who doesn't get those tax breaks, yet they get whatever kind of benefits living in that country. Their family is there, etc. Is it better to live in one country or another country? The answer is it depends. See, when we drop the importance and the this versus that, this country versus that country kind of thinking, you can really think for yourself. You're not going to be like swayed by shiny object syndrome or because this other person does it. You'll do it if it feels right. So, in relation to your vision, finance, leadership, operations, sales, marketing, innovation, your style, which is the best style, in flow. And if there's conditioning, you'll dissolve it along the way. And when you connect the dots looking backwards, as Steve Jobs said in his commencement speech, you'll see your style was the best style. Your business that you built, which produced the results, was your style. We can honestly say, oh yeah, I was in flow. I was in flow. And it also appeared my style. And so one of the key points that I got from this book here, the key point that I personally got from this book here, is being the observer. Being the observer, what we find is there is no this versus that kind of thinking or beliefs in the mind. Being the observer. As a matter of fact, those beliefs get dissolved as you no longer activate them or identify with them, and thus you remain in flow. Now, in the wonderful book, The Kabbalion by Three Initiates, or more specifically, William Walker Atkinson was said to be the sole author, but then some of my other sources say it was William Walker Atkinson, Paul Foster Case, and Michael Whitty. Nonetheless, we know that the book was released by Yogi Publication Society, and that was owned by William Walker Atkinson. Aside from that, what we learn in the book Kabbalion is the law of polarity. The law of polarity. Here's an example. If you walk into the room and the room is cold, let's say it's 5 or 6 degrees colder than you would like it to be, and you want to turn up the heat, you walk over and turn up the heat 4 or 5 degrees. You wouldn't necessarily crank up the heat all the way unless perhaps you cranked up the heat all the way for maybe 10 or 15 minutes and then bring it back to whatever temperature you'd like. So what they say is essentially it's a variation between the two. You would like the temperature to be whatever kind of temperature setting that you would like. You might not necessarily, if it's cold, crank it up all the way to hot, or if it's hot, you bring it all the way down to cold, unless you did it in that way that I just mentioned. Because if you left the temperature like that, eventually it would be that hot or that cold, whatever you set it to. So you set the temperature to whatever temperature you like. One temperature is not bad. The other temperature is not bad. You set it to whatever it is that feels good. You set it there. So being the observer means it's not this versus that. It's not cold versus hot, as in cold is better than hot and hot is better than cold. You simply choose what temperature you would like it to be in. Now, the same is true, what I found by applying this book when it came to business opportunities. So I might come across a scope of marketing strategies and marketing opportunities. Certainly with new emerging technologies, AI, AI-generated content, whatever kind of information that people seem to be interested in now, or whatever people's interests are now, whether we consider it to be a pendulum or not, generated by politics or whatever. Although, consider this for a moment. There can be pendulums that you genuinely desire to be in. Although, one can still not form an identity around that, because maybe at a particular point, you don't be involved with it. That's one way of looking at pendulums. So with whatever's happening, you know that your attitude determines what lifeline you are on. So it's how you relate to what appears here. You could relate to whatever appears here in this world, whatever's going on in the world, politics, news, market changes, AI, whatever way you would like. And so a great question to ask is, are you really thinking for yourself? Are you really relating to it from your vision? That's how you remain in your life track. So practically speaking, from my experience, and I had mentioned this in the other video, generally my position is flow-based entrepreneurship. And that remains true. Although there are various different angles I can communicate flow-based entrepreneurship from. And I'll adjust those angles based on whatever optimization data. Because I just like having the clients that I like working with. And I like doing the things that I love to do. And I like to go about how I grow my business in my way, which is my style. And while, as I mentioned, we can be inspired by watching many videos from entrepreneurs, nowadays with AI, there's so many different tactics and strategies of building businesses, growing your businesses, and applying AI to grow your business. Rather than getting overwhelmed by this information, I consume this information. I see what people are doing. It doesn't mean it hooks me and steals my energy, because what I have found is maybe one or two bits of information, or maybe a whole chunk of it, actually helps me in my business and then produces results. It contributes. So what I'm getting at is, by being the observer, you can dissolve the conditioning. In other words, detach from the pendulums, the automatic reactions that's generating the attachment to the pendulums, and then you have an enormous amount of clarity. And if you look at the mirror principle, then the mirror, or the world, reflects to be in harmony with you. Another way of saying it is, I say, everything appears to be in harmony with you. Of course, everything appears to be in harmony with you, because there's no conditioning in mind that suggests it is not that way. You have dissolved the conditioning along the way. What happens is then you're attuned to flow. You don't have excess importance. As he had mentioned, inner importance and outer importance. Everything is flow. You can, if there's a moment where you're about to react, detach from that conditioning. You know, I have in my school community, we have great discussions. I'm going to give a shout out to Anna Maria, who had posted this in one of the comments. I created a post called "Have No Hang-Ups on the Direct Path to $1 million." Now, what I meant by that is essentially having nothing in your mind that could trigger you, having no conditioning in your mind that can trigger you, which happens as you no longer identify with this conditioning. It dissolves. She said, this is the work for us to put off the old man and adopt the new identity. She had commented, it's true. Putting off what the Bible calls the old man is essentially the work that we do. Because you genuinely desire to manifest your vision in a flow-based way. I don't think I've ever met anyone that says, I would like to manifest my vision in a forced, stress-based way. They unknowingly think that that is the way. They think that it is completely normal to generate these illusions of being identified with pendulums, and also they may think unknowingly that that's just how it works. It is not how it works, and we know clearly now. It just appears that way through conditioning. So, putting off what the Bible refers to as the old man is a constant renewing of the mind. As it says in Romans 12:2, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Renewing of your mind. So the work is not identifying. That's the work. Letting things be. Deconditioning the mind. You are already oriented from your vision. It's like in psychocybernetics. The vision, when you commit to a vision, you are oriented from your vision. The vision, some way, somehow manifests. Some way, somehow. It happens. That's why I like what was mentioned, goal and the means. Also, it said something similar like that in psychocybernetics. The means whereby become apparent. Well, in reality transurfing, you choose the end frame. You are already that which you imagine yourself to be in imagination. And you let the means, the how appear through flow. It happens. We release the force of how it happens, the conditioning in mind that generates the force. And then these things like pendulums and appearances and conditions do not sway you. Literally, they don't, because you are the observer prior to the old man that thinks that these things can sway you. So you dissolve the old man thinking and the old man, because the old man is illusory, not real. So let's talk about the flow of variations. The alternative space creates a natural flow if you don't interfere with it. I call it interference patterns, which is based on conditioning, identification with the conditioning. That's why we dissolve the identification. There's less resistance, less importance, less need to control, less fighting the pendulums, or no resistance. Resistance is futile. No importance. By that is meant, it does not mean that you will not experience your vision. It means that by dropping importance, you'll experience it in the flow, in a flow-based way. So rather than trying to control how it happens, you release the identification. And then there's no fighting the pendulums. You just let the world be, in other words. The world lets you be. It appears that way. Literally, it appears that way. The world lets you be. You let the world be. And then you may have those kinds of experiences we talked about. You walk into a room, everything is flow. Oh, wait, I thought it was a pendulum. Walk into the room appears to be transformed. Now, for the entrepreneur who has a business, they step into their masterminds, they step into their coaching sessions, consulting sessions, client fulfillment, work, tasks, projects, initiatives, conversations with people in flow. In flow. What may have at one point appeared as pendulums in those areas that the individual genuinely would not like to identify with appears to transform rather than fighting the pendulums. So we can say it this way, the flow already knows the path of least resistance. Now, what if resistance appears along the way? That's okay. You can dissolve what generates the resistance by knowing that you are that observer beyond the conditioning in mind. So what I have found is emotions release. You don't identify with the thoughts. Even your body language, parasympathetic system is activated. Actually, a harmony between sympathetic and parasympathetic system. Also a harmony between divergent thinking and convergent thinking reconciles into what I call lateral being. Physical, emotional, mental, spiritual as one. The metaphysical and physical experienced as one. Not this versus that, not inner versus outer or outer versus inner. In perfect harmony. So what happens then is the world rearranges, or it appears that way, or you appear to go on a timeline that is flow-based, that reflects the vision. And the vision is manifested in form. So I trust you found this video to be helpful. Let's conclude this with an auto-suggestion to further encourage. You could say, I remain as I am, the unconditionally loving observer of it all, witnessing the world reflect who I am. As I remain as I am in flow, my vision appears to manifest by grace and grace alone. If you would like a copy of this mind map, the link is in the description. Thank you very much for watching. I'll talk with you soon. Take care.